The flames climbed higher than Nathan Thornfield had intended, reaching toward the Montana sky like desperate fingers clawing at clouds that would never answer their plea. He stood 50 yards back from his burning cabin, feeling the heat wash over his weathered face in waves that reminded him of the forge where his father had once shaped horseshoes and dreams. Everything he had built over 12 years was being consumed by fire. The rough-hewn logs he had cut and notched himself, the stone chimney that had taken him 3 weeks to complete, the small lean-to where he had sheltered his tools and tack. The flames devoured it all with an appetite that seemed personal, as if fire itself held a grudge against the life he had constructed in this remote valley. Nathan watched without flinching, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was witnessing. This was not an accident or a tragedy. It was a choice, deliberate and final, as the cancer that was eating away at his lungs with the same merciless efficiency that the fire showed toward his possessions. The letter from the doctor in Billings lay crumpled in his shirt pocket, its clinical language doing nothing to soften the brutal mathematics of his situation. 6 months, maybe 8 if he was fortunate and the disease decided to take its time. But Nathan had seen enough death to know that lung cancer was rarely patient or kind. He had watched his brother Thomas waste away from the same ailment, had sat beside his bed while he drowned slowly in his own fluids, and had sworn then that he would never inflict such a spectacle on anyone who might care enough to witness it. Not that there was anyone left to care. His wife Margaret had been dead for 5 years, taken by influenza during a particularly harsh winter when the nearest doctor was 3 days' ride through snow that reached a horse's belly. His only child, a daughter named Sarah, had married a banker from Denver and moved to a world of gas lamps and paved streets that might as well have been on the moon for all the connection it had to his wilderness existence. She wrote letters twice a year, dutiful communications filled with news of grandchildren he had never met and would now never know. The fire reached the roof beams now, sending showers of sparks into the evening air, like angry stars falling upward. Nathan had built this place with his own hands after the war, each log carefully selected and shaped, each stone in the foundation placed with the precision of a man who understood that in this country, the difference between good work and poor work could mean the difference between life and death. It had been a good cabin, solid and honest, proof against wind and weather and the various dangers that prowled the boundaries between civilization and wilderness. Now it was becoming memory, transforming from shelter into story, from substance into smoke. Nathan found a strange peace in watching his past disappear into the gathering darkness. There was something clean about fire, something pure in its absolute commitment to consumption. Unlike cancer, which crept and whispered and took its victims by degrees, fire was honest about its intentions. It wanted everything, and it took everything, and there was a kind of integrity in such complete destruction. The sound that interrupted his contemplation was so soft he almost missed it beneath the crackling roar of burning timber. A rhythmic drumming, distant but growing closer, accompanied by voices raised in harmony that seemed to weave through the night air like smoke itself. Nathan turned toward the sound, squinting through the firelight and shadows to see movement among the trees that bordered his property. They emerged from the darkness like figures from a fever dream, 20 or 30 Blackfoot warriors on horseback, their faces painted for what looked like ceremony rather than war. At their head rode a man Nathan recognized, despite the years that had passed since their last encounter, Chief Running Wolf, whose band had wintered in this valley before white settlers had claimed it for their own. The chief's presence here now seemed impossible, like a ghost materializing from flames and memory. The warriors spread out in a loose semicircle around the burning cabin, their horses dancing nervously at the heat and light, but held steady by hands that had learned patience through generations of dealing with prey animals and predators alike. They watched the fire with expressions that Nathan could not read in the shifting light. their faces painted with symbols that spoke of purposes he did not understand. Running Wolf dismounted and approached Nathan with the unhurried gait of a man who had learned that most situations could be improved by careful observation rather than hasty action. He was older than Nathan remembered, his black hair now streaked with silver and his face lined by decades of prairie sun and mountain wind. But his eyes held the same intelligence that Nathan recalled from their few previous meetings, the sharp awareness of a leader who survived by seeing more than others noticed. "White brother burns his lodge," Running Wolf observed, his English careful but clear. "This is strange thing to see." Nathan felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with the flames. "Private business," he said, his voice hoarse from smoke and something deeper. "No concern of yours." "Maham." The chief studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes taking in details that Nathan realized were probably obvious to someone who had spent a lifetime reading sign and interpreting the behavior of animals under stress. The weight loss, the hollow look around his eyes, the way he held himself like a man carrying pain. It would all be visible to someone who knew how to look. "A man who burns his own lodge is in great pain," Running Wolf said quietly. "Pain of body or pain of spirit, both make men do strange things." Behind the chief, the other warriors remained mounted but alert, their attention divided between the burning cabin and the conversation taking place in its light. Nathan could see younger men among them, boys who had probably never spoken to a white man except in anger or fear. There were older warriors too, men whose scars spoke of conflicts that predated his arrival in this valley, who had reasons to view any white settler with suspicion or outright hostility. "Why are you here?" Nathan asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. He had heard stories of what happened when Indian war parties encountered isolated homesteads, tales that usually ended with smoke rising from more than just cabin timbers. "We follow the smoke," Running Wolf replied. "My people, we know this valley from the time before memory. We know every tree, every stream, every place where the spirits speak to those who listen. Tonight, the spirits say that fire burns here for wrong reasons, that good lodge dies to feed bad medicine." The chief gestured toward the burning cabin, where the roof was beginning to collapse in on itself, with crashes that sent new cascades of sparks toward the stars. This lodge, it was built with respect, materials taken carefully, work done with skill, no waste or greed in its making. "Why does man who builds such lodge choose to burn it?" Nathan felt something crack inside his chest, a dam that had been holding back words and emotions for longer than he cared to calculate. Maybe it was the smoke, or the surreal nature of discussing his private despair with a Blackfoot war chief by the light of his burning home. Maybe it was simply that he had reached the point where secrets felt like more burden than he could carry. "Because I'm dying," he said, the words coming out flat and final as hammered steel. "Cancer in my lungs. Doctor says 6 months, maybe 8. And I've seen what that looks like. I won't put anyone through watching it, and I won't go through it myself. Figure if I burn everything down, make a clean end of it, then when my time comes, I can just walk into the mountains and let the wolves have what's left." Running Wolf listened without interruption, his expression never changing, even as Nathan's words grew more bitter and desperate. When the confession was finished, the chief was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire consume the last recognizable pieces of what had been Nathan's home. "White man's medicine tells you how long you will live?" Running Wolf asked finally. "That's what they do. That's what they're for. And you believe this medicine is stronger than the spirits that gave you breath in the first place?" Nathan almost laughed, but there was something in the chief's tone that stopped him, not mockery or condescension, but genuine curiosity, as if he was trying to understand a concept that seemed fundamentally foreign to his way of thinking. "I believe in what I can see and touch," Nathan replied, "and I can feel this disease eating me alive every time I draw breath." Running Wolf nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had suspected. "You build good lodge. But you think like man who lives alone too long. You forget that dying, like living, is not thing that happens to one person. It happens to all people connected to that person. When you burn your lodge and plan to walk into mountains, you steal from others the chance to help, to show honor, to say goodbye in proper way. The chief turned to look at his warriors, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, but whose attention suggested they understood more English than they let on. He spoke to them in Blackfoot, a rapid exchange that Nathan could not follow, but whose tone suggested planning rather than mere conversation. "My people," Running Wolf said, turning back to Nathan, "we have stories about men who choose fire instead of facing what comes after. Always, these stories end badly, not because fire kills, fire is good death for warrior who falls in battle, but because choosing fire alone, without ceremony, without witnesses, without passing of wisdom to next generation, this leaves spirit confused, unable to find path to ancestor lodge." As if responding to some signal Nathan had missed, the warriors began to dismount. They moved with practiced efficiency, some tending to horses, while others began to unpack bundles that Nathan hadn't noticed in the firelight. Within minutes, they had transformed the area around the burning cabin into what looked like the beginning of a camp, complete with materials that seemed far too organized and extensive for a chance encounter. "You came prepared for this," Nathan realized. "This wasn't accident, you being here tonight." Running Wolf smiled, the first time his expression had shown anything other than solemn attention. "Dreams told my medicine woman that White Brother in the valley would need help tonight. Dreams told her that man who learned to respect the land would forget to respect himself, would choose wrong kind of fire for wrong kind of death. Dreams told her to prepare, to bring what would be needed." One of the younger warriors approached, carrying an armload of tools that looked suspiciously like building implements, axes and adzes, coils of rope, even what appeared to be a draw knife for shaping logs. Behind him came others, bearing more tools and materials, creating a collection that represented significant preparation and planning. "You're planning to rebuild," Nathan said, understanding beginning to dawn, along with a kind of panic he hadn't expected. "You think you're going to put up a new cabin?" "Not think," Running Wolf corrected. "No, but not same cabin, and not for same man. Old cabin burned for old man who lived alone and planned to die alone. New cabin will be for new man, who learns that dying well requires help from friends, requires ceremony and witnesses, and passing of wisdom." The chief gestured toward the dying fire, where the last of Nathan's possessions were being reduced to ash and memory. "You burn your past tonight. Good. Past was lodge of loneliness, of man who forgot that no one lives or dies without touching other lives. But now we build future, lodge of man, who remembers that healing comes through community, that strength comes through accepting help from unexpected places." What followed was unlike anything Nathan had ever witnessed. Working by firelight and moonlight, the Blackfoot warriors began the process of clearing the site and preparing for construction. But this was not the haphazard effort of men trying to throw together a quick shelter. It was ceremony as much as carpentry, with each stage marked by ritual and consideration that transformed manual labor into something approaching sacred activity. They began by carefully gathering the ashes of Nathan's burned cabin, separating them into different piles according to what had been consumed. Wood ash went into one collection, metal remnants into another, stone from the foundation into a third. Running Wolf explained that these materials would be incorporated into the new structure, ensuring that the wisdom and experience of the old lodge would not be entirely lost. "Nothing truly dies," the chief said as he worked alongside his warriors, his hands as skilled with tools as any man Nathan had ever known. "Everything changes form, becomes part of something new. Your old lodge, it lives on in ash that will strengthen new wood, in stone that will anchor new foundation, in memory that will guide new construction. The work proceeded through the night with a rhythm that seemed almost musical. Men would take turns at different tasks, some cutting and shaping logs, others preparing the foundation, still others maintaining fires for light and warmth. There was singing too, quiet chants that seemed designed to coordinate effort and maintain spirit rather than to entertain or pass time. Nathan found himself drawn into the work despite his initial resistance. His body was weak from the cancer, his breathing labored from smoke and exertion, but the warriors seemed to understand his limitations without needing explanation. They gave him tasks that matched his strength, included him in ways that made him useful without overtaxing his declining health. As dawn approached and the skeleton of a new cabin began to take shape in the clearing, Nathan realized that something fundamental had changed in his relationship to his own mortality. The cancer was still there, still progressing with its inexorable hunger, but it no longer felt like the most important thing about him. He was a man helping to build a home, part of a community effort that would outlast his individual participation in it. "Why?" he asked Running Wolf during a brief rest while the younger men continued working. "Why do this for someone who isn't even your people?" The chief considered the question while watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. 12 winters ago, my youngest son was caught in blizzard while hunting elk. Lost, cold, would have died if White Rancher had not found him, brought him to lodge, fed him and warmed him and showed him safe path home. That rancher, he asked for nothing, expected nothing, simply did what needed doing because it was right thing to do. Nathan felt something stir in his memory. 12 years ago. Small boy, maybe 14, found him half frozen about 2 miles from here during that bad storm in February. That boy is now war chief among my people, leader of young men who ride with us tonight. He told them story many times, how white man who lived alone chose to save Indian boy, even though it could have brought trouble, even though some white men would have turned away. Tonight we repay that kindness, but we also honor the man who showed my son that some bridges between peoples are built with simple humanity rather than politics or treaties. The cabin that took shape as the sun climbed higher was both like and unlike the one that had burned. The basic structure was familiar: log walls, stone foundation, shingled roof, but the details spoke of different traditions and priorities. There were symbols carved into the doorframe, protective designs that Running Wolf said would help spirits find their way. The windows were positioned to catch both morning and evening light, creating a dwelling that would be bright throughout the day. Most importantly, the main room was larger than Nathan would have built for himself, sized for gatherings rather than solitude. "You build this for company," Nathan observed as the walls rose under the skilled hands of men who had clearly done such work before. "Build it for man who learns to accept company," Running Wolf corrected. "Your old lodge, it was fortress against world. This lodge, it is invitation to world. People can come here, share food and fire and stories. You can teach white children about land, teach Indian children about white man's tools and ways. Knowledge shared in both directions, understanding built through conversation rather than conflict. By midday, the basic structure was complete and the detail work had begun. Women had arrived from the Blackfoot camp, bringing food and additional materials, transforming the construction site into something that felt like a community celebration. Nathan found himself surrounded by people of all ages, from children who watched the work with wide eyes to elders who offered advice and approval as the cabin took final form. The moment when they raised the roof beam was marked by ceremony that Nathan was invited to participate in, despite his status as an outsider. He placed his hands on the timber alongside Running Wolf and several other men, feeling the weight of wood that would shelter him for whatever time remained and beyond. Words were spoken in Blackfoot that he could not understand, but their intention was clear. Blessing, protection, hope for the future that this structure would make possible. As evening approached and the cabin neared completion, Nathan felt a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The cancer was still there, still claiming more of his strength with each passing day, but it felt different now. Not like an enemy to be fought or fled from, but like a companion he was learning to walk alongside. Death was still coming, but it would find him in a home built by friends, surrounded by community rather than consumed by isolation. "It's beautiful," he said to Running Wolf, as they stood together watching the final details being added to what had become not just a cabin, but a symbol of something larger. "More beautiful than anything I could have built alone." "All good things require many hands," the chief replied. "Lodge is not just wood and stone. It is intentions of people who build it, hopes of people who will live in it, memories that will be made within its walls. You could cut trees and shape logs, but you could not have built this kind of lodge by yourself." The celebration that followed the completion of the cabin lasted well into the night. Food was shared, stories told, songs sung around fires that warmed bodies and spirits alike. Nathan found himself the guest of honor at a gathering that felt both foreign and familiar, included in rituals he did not fully understand, but whose warmth and generosity needed no translation. Children who had never seen a white man up close came to touch his hair and examine his clothes, their curiosity satisfied by patient answers to questions that ranged from practical to profound. Adults shared their own stories of encounters with white settlers, some bitter and some sweet, but all offered in a spirit of honesty that suggested walls being lowered rather than raised. As the fires burned low and people began to prepare for sleep, Running Wolf approached Nathan with a final gift, a small medicine bundle containing herbs and stones that he said would help with pain and breathing. "Not cure," the chief said carefully. "No medicine can turn back time or undo what has already begun. But these will help you sleep better, hurt less, think more clearly about what you want to do with days that remain." Nathan accepted the bundle with hands that trembled from more than weakness. "I don't know how to repay this. Any of this." "Repayment is simple," Running Wolf replied. "Use this lodge as it was meant to be used. Welcome people who need shelter, share knowledge with those who hunger for it, die when your time comes surrounded by friends rather than alone in wilderness. Make your ending into beginning for others who will remember how white man and Indian people worked together to build something good." In the months that followed, Nathan's cabin became a crossroads where different worlds met and mingled. White travelers found shelter and directions. Indian families stopped to trade and rest. Children of both races learned from an old man who had been given the gift of time to share what he had learned. The cancer progressed as the doctor had predicted, but slowly and without the despair that Nathan had expected. When the end finally came, on a spring morning when wildflowers were beginning to bloom in the meadow behind his cabin, Nathan was surrounded by voices raised in songs from two traditions. His death was witnessed and honored. His story became part of the oral history of both peoples who had claimed him as their own. The cabin continued to serve as a meeting place long after he was gone, a reminder that bridges between worlds could be built with nothing more than willingness to help and acceptance of help in return. The ashes from Nathan's original cabin, carefully preserved and incorporated into the structure that replaced it, remained visible in the mortar that held the stones together. A physical reminder that destruction could be transformed into foundation, that endings could become beginnings, and that sometimes the best way to honor a life was to ensure it became part of something larger than itself.